Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs and share our experience to hopefully help you have your best game. Hello, James.
Hello, Jared.
How are you today?
I am doing well. How are you?
I am well as well. And actually, to think about it, depending on how we play our schedule, we will be able to record in person next week.
Yes, that would be amazing.
That'll be great, which will mean no video, but oh well. Not a big deal. Not a big deal. This is our secondary means of reaching people anyway, so that doesn't really matter all that much. So let me make sure I know I'm correct on things for the sake of references. Have you played your next session of Traveler yet, or no?
I have not. So this Friday will be the last set of High and Dry. So that will be finished. And then my single player has canceled on me the last 2 weeks for various personal reasons on the other campaign. And that's just life happens.
Whatever.
Well, he's a new dad, so that's a big deal.
It is. That's a lame excuse. That's actually a really good excuse. That's an explanation is what that is, actually. Well, that's cool then. So the next week we can talk about wrapping up High and Dry. But as we just talked about a little bit before we started recording, we last time we talked about campaign level things, and we talked about some really big top level stuff. And obviously there's that intermediate ground of the adventure itself, the movie or the book in the series. But then there's the encounter or the scene, if you want to use more cinematic game planning terminology. And we talked about that. Let's go ahead and actually talk about that. So we're going to go from the top of the pyramid, this inverted pyramid of big picture to most concrete, smallest in scope picture, the scene or the encounter, with the adventure in between. Let's go ahead and skip down to the point of the inverted pyramid and talk about scenes or encounters. And I personally am going to use those terms interchangeably. The idea of a scene is something that I was only introduced to within the last several years with the explicit terminology of, cinematic gaming. But I think that the terms can be used interchangeably. What do you think about that? Do you think there's enough of a distinction, or do you think we can go ahead and use them together?
No, I agree completely. It was always encounter for me when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons. And then when I was introduced to 2D20 and their system, that's when scene really became more of the understanding, because it is a more cinematic style. But I think that they can be used interchangeably because they cover the same space in the game.
Let's try to nail that down too. I think most people, you go, okay, I know what an encounter is. But let's nail that down as at least a general enough definition so that it's applicable in different kinds of games. When you think encounter or scene within a game, what are you thinking? What comes to mind?
Yeah, I think of it as when thinking of an encounter, I think of it as a relatively short period of time in which something is being done. That's why encounter is the word that we usually use, because it's either a combat encounter or a role and play encounter or a travel situation. Those all kind of fulfill the same role if you're actively playing through it. Scene is the same, in my opinion. It's just that scene, like we said, is more cinematic, that you're thinking of, okay, this is the period in which we're actively playing before we do some sort of time skip that will take us to the next scene. So the classic example that I think of is the scene drop in Star Wars when they're changing to the next scene, and you're like, okay, so they just did the pan across the screen and now you're in a new location. It's the same thing in almost every role-playing game I played, where, okay, we're doing this role-play section and then cut to new role-play section or combat. And then that's a new scene or encounter, and then cut to the next thing.
Yeah, and I'll add to it. This is looking back. It seems to me that the definition, or the most common definition of encounter, over the years, especially starting with D&D first edition or basic, even before that, is that's when I think the implication is it's a combat encounter. It's a sequence at the table where the characters are in a specific place and they face a specific challenge more than likely they're fighting something, and they're going to roll. They're going to roll through things. And there are all kinds of other implications that are attendant to that, like you're going to be in initiative order and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I will expand that definition to make it more, like I said, interchangeable with scene. And so for me, when I think of either of those things, it's a place or it's a moment. It could be very short, or it could be longer in terms of time it takes up within the game world, where specific characters are involved in specific activities at a specific place. And here I'll add something to it that has something to do with the overall plot. Now, you could do things within an encounter or a scene that don't, but pointing toward our discussion for today, the idea of how do you plan these kinds of things, as GM, you're planning things almost exclusively that have to do with the plot, that have to do with the story. You're not saying, hey, I'm gonna plan something or put something together more than likely that has absolutely nothing to do with the story, nor the characters, nor anything else. That sounds to me like a tremendous waste of time for people at the table. Now, you could say, well, there's time for character development, like Shadow Dark and Conan have the carousing systems. Those have to do with the characters and can serve as lead outs from an adventure or a lead into an adventure. And I mean, they kind of work on like narrative time. But anyway, okay. So you had a couple of questions and I had some thoughts too. Go ahead and hit me up. What's your first thought or question?
Yeah. So one of the things for me when I've been both a player and now a GM and trying to figure out scenes and encounters, one of the big things that I always come back to is mapping. So, and I put in my question that there are like 3 different things that I've heard for like mapping an encounter: theater of the mind, like literal drawn maps, and then miniature use. And I think that those last 2, some people think of as they're the one thing, but they are not. They can be different.
I agree completely. And you know what? That's a really good point. That's a sharp and smart distinction to make. I'll shut up.
Okay. It's just when I think about those, the theater of the mind is great. Like that's what we did with my last session of Traveler that I was able to play. We actually used theater of the mind for an entire combat encounter, which worked out really well because one player was playing multiple characters. It allowed us to really go back and forth really easily. But I'm thinking in my game where I'm having multiple players, I'm going to need like a map or to use miniatures or something for them all to keep track of each other, even more than I will need it to keep track of as the GM. And I think there's some level of difference there, but I also think each one of those have downsides as well, because with miniatures, well, people are like, well, if I don't see it, it's not there. Whereas if it's theater of the mind, it's hard to keep track of, okay, but where exactly is everyone? And then mapping is somewhere in the middle. It has the benefits and downsides of each one, depending on how detailed you get.
Okay, that's interesting. It's an interesting question because you're starting in a different place from where I anticipated. But if we're already assuming that the vast majority of encounters or scenes that you as a GM are going to plan, that is, put some kind of time into to think about the space and think about the challenge, which most often will take the form of non-player characters and maybe environmental sorts of things. You do have to think of like, well, how do I present this? How do I convey the space and the placement and the movement of these different things that are in the scene or the encounter? How do I do that? And assuming that it already plays a role in the story, we don't have to discuss that. So then it's moving to this is really smart, actually, because it puts you in a position, if you start thinking this or thinking about this kind of question early, you're already thinking about what does the scene look like? How is it laid out? How can I make it more interesting? Am I trying to gild the lily too much? Because the other side of all those questions is, and how do I convey this to my players and how do we work through it? For me, okay, usually It's funny. Usually I've been theater of the mind, or in more recent years, miniatures of some sort or another. And I hadn't really thought of mapping as a distinct, an additional, like, call it category. But I think it's smart to think of it that way, because usually what happens is I will usually approach most things from theater of the mind just because it's easier that way. And I've never been one to have miniatures and terrain until, the last like 5-6 years, when I've picked up some of these things and I've made some stuff myself. So usually the mapping happens because I have to convey understanding. And so I draw some crappy little, map of like, this is what the cavern looks like, or this is what the Starship Bridge is, this is how it's laid out, and this is where, and I'm just doodling on it. And we're, people are like taking extra dice and saying, that's me, and they move the things around. But if you approach the planning of it, thinking to yourself, okay, because, everything, think about it economically. Your time is scarce, and your planning time, therefore, for this hobby is scarce. And so if you think about an encounter and say to yourself, what's the best way to convey the information for this? And the other side of that question is, what is this encounter really worth? Like, is it an interaction with the mayor in his office does not need minis.
Right.
It doesn't need a map. Whereas like the stereotypical or archetypal or whatever you want to call it, like boss fight at the end of a D&D adventure, I think there's an expectation that you have all this stuff. So if you were going to have minis or a map, that would be the one that you would want to plan it for. So I think the initial questions are, how complicated is the layout of the environment and the placement and movement of the NPCs, if there are NPCs there, which more than likely there will be. How complicated is it? How complicated will be it for me to convey it to the players? And this is like a sliding scale. How important is this encounter? How cool will it be if we have terrain? So I think those are questions to answer when you're considering like which of those three to go in your mind as you're planning.
And I'm going to throw out really quick, one of the reasons that I've made the distinction of mapping is because I never thought about it this way until I actually had a situation in a campaign where my GM put me into, basically it was a section of a city. And what I was doing was my character was essentially tailing someone through the city. Not down a street or through a singular building where you have floors, but through several like city blocks, to where we didn't need minis to be like, okay, we're assuming your character is competent in this, like roll your stealth, whatever it is, like if you need to do that. But generally, kind of like what I'll probably be doing Traveler, it's supposed to be a competent character who can handle this. But it's such a large area that you don't want to print out what you would use for a miniature, but also it's so big that it's kind of hard to keep track of theater in the mind, where having a map that you can like sit and like X where you start and then follow down the roads as you're moving through this several city blocks, it made it really nice for us to keep track of this kind of stuff. But it was this level of thing where you don't want miniatures, but theater of the mind doesn't really work as well. So having that separation was really nice for that kind of level of scene, where it's like the scene is just we're tracking this one person as you're doing this. And it did have some major narrative implications of what this ended up doing. So that's kind of why I've questioned this, is because I do have some plans for my game coming up where that might be useful. And that's why I kind of wanted to get your opinion on it.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. Like, so you have these three separate, like, general levels of detail. Like, how much detail obviously, if you go theater of the mind, you have to have a description. Mm-hmm. But recognize that with theater of the mind, there is an outward limit to the efficacy of your descriptive words.
Correct.
And I had this years ago. Years ago, I played couple of 5e adventures with some friends of mine, and the guy running it, he was really excited. I think he had a very clear idea of this really great location, and he really wanted to describe it. And I remember this one like throne room kind of guild, like whatever kind of place. Bunch of like, leaders, great leaders gathered in this, great hall with pennants and stuff like that. And he went on for like, and I remember like glancing at my watch, he went on for like 10 or 12 minutes describing in great. And the problem is that like some of it was cool. Some of it was like, I just didn't care. And then other parts of it was like, I can't remember all of this. And so there's a point where like you've got to say, all right, if we're going to go theater of the mind, how do I best? Because the question for me is, how can I convey this? Not describe, but actually convey. Like my description has to resonate and with you, and you have to comprehend it enough that it's actionable. That we're working on somewhat this. It's like saying to someone, hey, let's like you're playing music with a bunch of people and you say, let's play in this key. Okay, now we've got like a common framework here. So I think the issue with theater of the mind, if you decide, okay, this encounter, this scene is best, it's best for theater of mind because of what role it plays in the story and because of like how important is those questions we talked about a moment ago, then it's the issue of, well, then how do you do theater of the mind? How best do you describe it? What are your thoughts on that? I've got some ideas, but I'm interested in what you're thinking about this.
Yeah. So for me, when it comes to theater of the mind situations, in my experience, less is more. So you want to really point out the really big, important things. Like, here are the big, important things that you need to remember as a player. I've never seen a theater of the mind situation where your description is more than like 2 minutes actually work. It always causes more headache than it causes, like gives benefit. But that's what you want to explain, the big things. And then as soon as they've covered everything in that, then you can move on to the next. Like if you're going to move on to a new theater of the mind situation, then you do that. But you do not want to go into super detailed levels of description. If you're going to do that, you're better off going in, making a real map and putting miniatures on the table. Because then if you don't describe something and they want to ask, well, what's on that table right there? You can then describe it, but you're not wasting everyone's time doing that upfront theater of the mind.
Yeah. So, and this is important. I am completely on the same page with you. Totally agree. This then informs what you are going to put in whatever you use for session prep. Like if you're the kind of person who, if you just sit and think about it enough, you'll remember it. Or maybe you jot down notes, or maybe you have a formal outline. Whatever you put together, whether it's physical or it's in your gray matter, to be ready for the session. A part of this is considering, okay, what do I need to convey and how do I need to convey it? So if I'm going to describe, said, a throne room to the players, I agree. What are the most salient, not necessarily, I don't think the salient points of, say, like a room, like the structure itself. What are the most important points that the characters might interact with? So give them a sense of like scope, like, hey, it's a big drafty throne room and it's a little threadbare. Like maybe this was regal 30 or 40 years ago. Now it looks like your grandmother's parlor. It's kind of dated, or it's so opulent. It's so amazing. Give them a sense of how their characters might perceive it, and then give them a couple of the major details with which they will interact. And that's obviously, it's going to vary from story to story and moment to moment. But yeah, writing those things down in your notes is important. I also think in theater of the mind, it's perfectly fine to leave space. I think it's actually a good thing to leave space for your players to fill in some gaps and encourage them to, because then they take ownership. I mean, obviously, if they try to like beat you over the head with it to like, win some cheap advantage and win the encounter because they've, interpreted the layout of the room in such a way that it perfectly interacts with their character's 5th level class ability or something like that, then you can hit them with a rolled up newspaper. But otherwise, yeah, I try to get people, what does it look like? So what does the throne look like? What is it shaped like? Things like that. But yeah, that's a really good approach. What's most important? What's most important for the characters?
Yeah, I agree completely.
Okay. Let's talk about, I like this mapping thing, and it really makes sense. Like the word that came to mind when you were talking about moving around a city Obviously, if there were too much detail, like every single block and every single trash can or something like that, and you're counting, like, you know, if you're doing 5e and you're like counting how many squares the mini can move, then it just becomes tedious and stupid. But if you just hand wave too much of it, then you lose detail. I kept thinking montage.
Yeah.
As like, but I like that. It's that intermediate stage between, I'm just describing this to you and you're going to have it in your head. And I recognize that it's actually, aside from these really high points that I explained to you, the walls are red. There are 4 tapestries on the right and 3 bigger ones on the left. Okay, you know, those kinds of objective things. But I like the idea of something to convey a bigger sense, less detail, but their scope, because you want them to understand, like, this is how the city, for example, is laid out, or this is how the starship is laid out. Here's the deck plans of the whole ship, or something like that.
It also gives you a really good chance that if we're partially defining, at least a part of scenes or encounters are dice rolls, it makes it really easy, because then as you're following through the map, if there are certain points where you want characters to make dice rolls, it's really easy, because if you've already planned out, this is the map, this is the direction things are going to be going, you know, when they hit this point, they need to make a stealth check, or at this point, they need to make a persuade, or this point, they need to do different things. It allows you to build that in, but it's not so much so that, okay, I'm building this out with theater of the mind of, okay, well, you just asked something that's going to require this. Me as the GM, I know that this situation is going to arise here. You need to do this. But it allows us to contain that without it being too forceful, because, well, you followed him here, therefore you're going to need to do this.
Yeah, that I also could see, like with like say a city map, again, using that as an example, you have an idea encounter-wise, like, okay, as they move through the city, if they move through this area, and I guess you could take this 2 different approaches. You could say, you could have marked off in your mind, this warehouse is where the Thieves Guild is hidden. And this little cafe, boarded up cafe down the street, is where like a couple of street urchins that they pay or threaten keep watch. Okay, so then if the player characters go to those places and they say, I'm looking around or something like that, then you've got your dice rolls right there. Or you place the Thieves Guild location and the little street urchin site wherever it is they end up going. I actually prefer the former, because then you build out the city and it seems to have like some kind of coherence and life that's connected to the story that you're trying to not tell but create with your players. You know, the neat thing too with maps is that, and I'm talking about, so again, we're saying maps, not like battle maps, not like, oh, I bought this book of battle maps and it's all the little 1-inch squares. That's not a map. A map is something that covers a larger area. Like recently in the Star Trek Adventures campaign that I'm running, a couple of months ago, I got like a wild hair, and I decided that I was going to take a flat screen television and build a tabletop box to use as a display. Instead of, putting it vertically, it's horizontal. And I have a surface over the top of it. So if I wanted to use it for battle map purposes with minis, I can. But for the Starfleet stuff, I'm using it for like, here's the map of the Beta Quadrant and stuff like that, just to give them a sense of like scope and place and movement. Yeah, there's a lot of different things obviously you could do to find maps or create them that then actually, I think, like you're talking about, say, a city, that really could tie in with world building, because it gives you, the GM, this physical representation that you are then going to be probably energized creatively to fill up with stuff. And if you're taking notes as your player characters move through it, maybe they'll inspire you to come up with some ideas as well.
I agree. And that's just kind of, in a city's one example, like in Traveler, if for some reason they end up on like a planet, could be the same thing as well if they're in a ship, or even just a really big ship. Like, okay, there's not a chance of them getting into combat in this situation, but they're just now we're getting a little too detailed chart, but like an Empress class, like warship, hopefully you're not fighting there or you're going to lose, but you could be traveling through it if it's a naval campaign.
Well, there's actually a in the Fifth Frontier War opening moves mini campaign. There is at the very end of it, there is a time when you could end up in personnel level combat on a warship. So having deck plans, which of course Mongoose will sell you, having deck plans is then really useful. The wonderful thing about any kind of actual visual representation, moving away from theater of the mind, the useful thing about it is obviously is there's less argument because there's probably less misunderstanding. The obviously the downside to that is more prep, especially when you move to miniatures. Now, do you or have you, like as a player, how often have you used miniatures? And I don't just mean a little, like, this is my fighter, and I'm going to put it in, and your buddy's got like, a flat grid map that he draws some, like, that's a tree and that's a this. It's just all two-dimensional except for your miniatures. How often or how regular is that? How regular is use of miniatures with other three-dimensional representations like terrain and buildings and things like that? And where do you see that as you as a GM? That obviously being the biggest burden when it comes to this.
Yeah. So in my experience, mostly as a player, because so far as a GM, most of my stuff has been theater of the mind just because of what we've been doing. But as a player, I would say 60% miniatures, 30% theater of the mind, 10% mapping are kind of the breakdowns of what I've experienced in my gaming journey. Personally, I like theater of the mind better because it gives more freedom of being able to kind of, oh, I want to throw this in there now and allow that to happen. Or it allows me to kind of work with my players to make decisions. People, when you have the miniatures, they tend to get very like, it's what's right there and that's what you have to use. So my guess is it's still probably going to be, for me, it'll probably be slightly more theater of the mind than miniatures, and still mapping is the lowest, but those percentages will probably be different.
Yeah, I think the mapping it's less an issue of like, oh, this is hard to use or I don't want. It's more like I think it's important to think of that as an approach to your encounter planning, because it offers some opportunities that the other two do not. But I think it's more of a huh?
I was just gonna say it's more specific.
It's more specific. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be as universally applicable. I've been. It's weird like I said, it's been about the last 5.5 years. It's been about the last 5-some years that I have actually done like miniatures beyond just like, okay, I bought a bag of El Cheapo plastic D&D miniatures on eBay. This is a true story. And, I just try to use them as closely. Okay, it has a sword. Okay, your character uses good, fine. I was never one to like, I recognize the financial sucking sound that those things create. And so I never want, like Dwarven Forge and all these people spending hundreds of dollars to build like their dungeon. I don't want to do that because I don't want to spend the money and I don't want all this stuff. Now I do have a hot wire cutting table that I picked up about like right when COVID started, actually is when I got it. And so I've built some buildings and other terrain and things like that with that. But it's tough because it's really neat. And I like to reserve that stuff like in fantasy games for what I think will be like the coolest encounters, because they take the most effort. But I think you're right. That point you made about how the more you detail it out, the more people get hooked on and stuck on the details. And for me, it starts the role-playing game, the game side of it starts to take center stage and can risk completely taking center stage over the story and players trying to play a role, or players who aren't so comfortable with or inclined toward playing a role, it's just much easier to default to game. So yeah, there's definitely an upside to it at the table. There's also a downside, and then there's the downside of like all the money you're going to spend on these little bits and bobs, and where are you going to put them all? And like, how often are you going to use that barn? I have run into that. I have this barn that I have. The barn shows up like everywhere. And there's just a point where I'm like, I'm not going to build the tavern because I don't want everything to be the tavern. So yeah,
right.
minis are tough in that respect. So we've hit like one topic and looked at these three different angles of it that are related to encounter planning. We haven't talked at all about like, how do you figure out how to build an encounter that fits into a story, or how do you come up with an encounter that maybe spotlights one or two of the player characters in a way that their player will particularly like. We haven't talked about that at all, but I think this is really an important angle because maybe people only think about those kinds of things, or like in D&D land, they obsess about like, this challenge rating like this, or if you're playing Pathfinder, it's like everything is to serve the math of character leveling, and I think this is actually a good place to start. Like how am I what's the scene gonna look like, and how am I gonna convey that to people?
Well, and I'll just throw this out there for any new GMs that are listening or players that want to get into GMing. So far, in my experience of the few times that I've actually GM'd, I was very worried about encounter balancing. Like that's the thing that you'll watch videos and people talk about all the time. And in my experience, encounter balancing is really simple. You do what you think is going to be correct. And then if your players do a really good job and you need to throw in a few more minions to make it work, you just increase the number of stat blocks on your sheet. Or, oh no, I'm about to have a total party wipe. I'm just going to erase that guy showing up to make it a little bit more like you can do that really easily. Yeah, I don't think that's unfair. I think that's just like it serves the story. But that's not as I'm just saying this because it seems like something that's really scary, but once you get into it, it's really simple. So I think that there are a lot of other things that we could cover and spend our time on those levels of things. Once you do it once or twice, you're not going to have issues with it anymore. I
think that's a really good point, actually. So looking at this, and we'll do multiple episodes on encounter building, just call it that. And this is one aspect of them, like the physical environment and how do you convey it and how do you work through it at the table. But yeah, I think this is actually a piece that you can put to bed. Like if you're playing D&D, I think it goes without saying that you're not going to take like an ancient red dragon and dump it on your second level party. Like you don't need to be like, what is the challenge? You don't need to do that. But beyond that, I think, and I remember years ago getting really tied up in like 3.0 and 3.5 era, getting really tied up. Like, I want to do this right. And then I finally was like, F this. I'm just tired of, I'm trying to squeeze the story through this rules, like this matrix of rules. And I don't ever want to do that. Like the story and the excitement and the characters. That's what I'm there for. I'm not there for if I just wanted to play the rules, I should just play a skirmish game or a war game, and just call it what it is. And so I think, James, that's actually a really good bit of advice, especially in this era where for so many people, role-playing games means D&D, which means 5.5 or whatever it's called now, which means you're supposed to balance the encounters. Well, when the Balrog showed up, that was not a balanced encounter. Now someone's, but Gandalf, this, that, the whatever, like that. No. It not every encounter, it doesn't have to. That's a whole nother issue, but
Correct.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Don't sweat it. Don't get wrapped around the axle or tied up on that. It's not worth it because you can shift stuff behind the screen figuratively and your players will never know.
Fair. And I do have another question for you that I think we can cover in time, possibly. So I don't know whether this should end up here or when we go back to our discussion about adventures. Mm-hmm. But how much combat is too much combat?
Oh, boy.
Because I know that this is, And for me, I think I have somewhat of an answer, but when I encounter this, having talked to other GMs, some of them are very, very combat heavy. Like the majority of what they do is combat. But other GMs, it's almost all role play, and you only do combat if you mess up. So what are your thoughts?
Well, let's do this. Let's use this. Let's preface this and then use that as a lead out. And then we'll do an episode just on that.
Perfect.
The different types of encounters with the lurking question of how much combat is too much. I think that this is, personally, I think this is entirely dependent on the preferences of the GM and the players. And I think that it connects to what is the nature of this story, of this adventure. Is this adventure like part of a campaign, or is it a one-off? Is the expectation or hope that we're going to build these characters and this story? Now, building them could be mechanically or story-wise. Is this something that's going to stretch out over a long period of time or not? But those things, I think, would go into helping you determine that. But I think really it's mostly dependent on the preferences of the folks who are at the table. I think variety is a good thing, but I also think that you should, if everyone's happy with pie, reserve cake for only every once in a blue moon. But how you go about doing that, that's a whole other episode. And that's a good question.
Yeah, and just my preface with there is I think there is a good balance between it, and we can get more into that in another episode. But that's where I think there really is a careful balance that a GM has to strike with most parties.
Yeah,
for
I
that.
think you're right. Okay, so we're going to talk about Traveler next time, and the time after that, we're going to talk about this sticky issue.
That sounds great.
All right, excellent. We'll talk to you then.
All right, talk to you then.
Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes.